Episode 24, Gimme Back My Country, in which we track the lies of white nationalism through the history of country music. There is a new flavor of racist ideology on the market in America. White nationalism has gone mainstream since Trump's first term in office. But before we can even begin a discussion of the issue, we're faced with a humongous problem. You see, American white nationalists start from quite a few basic assumptions, all of them demonstrably wrong. 1. They believe that being relatively light-skinned, with a number of ancestors from Europe, makes a person a member of a biologically distinct white race. 2. They believe that white is not only a distinct biological category, they then claim that white Americans are an actual ethnic group, sharing a number of specific cultural traits only with other white Americans. 3. They often believe that an actual conspiracy exists, its sole aim being to undermine, dilute, and eventually replace the white race, along with its distinct white history and white culture. 4. They characterize every legislative or economic gain made by brown and black people as necessarily taking something away from white people. 5. They characterize every attempt to redress the social consequences of 400 years of institutionalized racism and disenfranchisement as reverse racism. 6. They claim the physical space or territory within U.S. borders as the rightful homeland of their own privileged caste, a caste which they refer to as their race or ethnic group, and they base this on an historical right of conquest. 7. They claim that this conquest of territory through violence was achieved solely through the toil and sacrifice of their own privileged caste, which they again refer to as their race or ethnic group. 8. They further claim a right to establish their own narrative, with all its inaccuracies, accuracies, lies, omissions, as the official foundational story of the nation. 9. Anything which this privileged caste, and I'm going to repeat the word caste again and again, because they are not a race, they are not an ethnic group, they are a caste. Anything which this privileged caste has done, still does, or simply likes, is called white culture. And by extension, it gets deemed as the only real American culture. In this reckoning, Indigenous American, Black American, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Latino American cultures, histories, and experiences are mere addendums to the real America. And in this reckoning, a white person whose ancestors were, say, Irish, Italian, or Jewish, and arrived in the USA just over a century ago, can more easily become part of the real America than a black person whose ancestors have been in America since the early 1600s. This is the point where, if I actually had any listeners among MAGA types and white nationalists, they would protest that black Americans can be real Americans. But we know they don't mean it. We know they do not mean it because Black history is taught as something to the side of official American history. The reason we need a Black History Month is precisely because Black history is not taught properly in schools. Black Americans are only tentatively accepted as real Americans if they agree to repeat an official story they did not write and embrace a story that their ancestors did not live. And when a Black American points out that they have a different story, they are accused of being divisive. If Black history were treated as a truly co-equal and integral part of U.S. history, no one would expect Black Americans to laud the wisdom of slaveholding founding fathers. And no one would expect Black Americans to celebrate a project which only gave them the right to fully participate in it just 60 years ago. The same project which is now aggressively seeking to undermine the very enfranchisement which Black America only so recently won. White grievance, expressing itself through violence, such as that seen just over 5 years ago at the U.S. Capitol, sees rioters later given sweeping presidential pardons, while a lone Black man kneeling in silent protest at police brutality sees his life and livelihood destroyed. One protest took place before a game of football. The other sought to overturn a democratic election at the center of government. Each one of the assumptions made by white nationalists, the ones numbered above, if taken in turn, could see entire books being written, and many have been written, systematically demolishing each and every point. Most of us, though, never get the chance or time to read every book written by scholars in the fields of history, politics, sociology, folklore, genetics, anthropology, economics, or religion. So sometimes it's good when all of these interlocking disciplines can be set aside for a moment, and the complexities of something as ugly and stupid as white nationalism can manage to be illustrated with a more fun and entertaining example. But before we do this, let me share what compelled me to write this piece in the first place. Hello, I'm your host, Brian Halper. Welcome to the time before we were white. A few months ago, a GOP U.S. Senator from Missouri named Eric Schmidt gave a speech at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. In this speech, he laid out many of the points also made by white nationalists, with a particular emphasis on the idea that to be a real American, it's not enough to simply buy into a shared set of democratic values or ideals. No, real Americans need to be the descendants of those who fought and bled in America's War of Independence and in its colonial frontier wars. Real Americans must be the sons and daughters of those who were deeply invested in the making of colonialist America. Clearing forests, damming rivers, taking up land grants, shooting and trapping, opening mines and banks, building roads and towns and mills and factories. Only real Americans can understand the birthright gained to a land when that land was forged in justifiable violence against heathen savages. Real Americans should venerate the words of their founding fathers. Real Americans are always Christians. It is clear that Schmidt was using these so-called legacy Americans as a proxy for white people. Eric Schmidt's speech enraged me, and I hope many other decent people, for a number of reasons. In the first instance, he's a MAGA quisling from the state where I was born. It feels almost personal. Besides, anyone still supporting the MAGA movement who claims that they are not fascist, racist, or both, are simply fools or liars. But what makes Schmidt's dumb, sub-Nazi blood and soil ramblings worse is the fact that virtually none of his own family were even in America at the time of the events he considers so crucial to the forming of a true American identity. His idiocy and hypocrisy are so profound that I'm working on a piece for an upcoming podcast episode dedicated especially to him and him alone. More recently, a nasty little toad popped out of his hole at a Senate congressional hearing for the confirmation of Trump's, or perhaps Stephen Miller's, pick for U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. Now, this might sound like a thing of interest to only the geekiest of political geeks out there, but the post on offer is one of the most senior roles within the State Department and involves running the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, which in turn sets the agenda for U.S. interaction with various international organizations, including the United Nations. Put simply, the holder of this post is only a step or two away from the actual Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. The candidate for this job, Jeremy Carl, is a man from a Jewish background who has converted to the Presbyterian flavor of Christianity. He is also a rabid and unapologetic white nationalist. Under questioning from Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, Mr. Carl came out with some of the most ridiculous, cringeworthy, and odious white nationalist claptrap you're ever likely to hear broadcast from the halls of Congress. No need to suffer through the entire transcript. Here are some choice excerpts abridged for brevity and clarity. Please refer to the show transcript for editing marks showing where questions or answers may have been abridged. Question: one of the things you have said is that anti-white discrimination is the most pervasive and politically salient form of racism today. So, do you continue to believe that anti-white discrimination is more salient than the discrimination faced today by blacks, Latinos, Muslims, or other American groups? Answer: we've done an incredible job in this administration of getting rid of certain policies that discriminate, particularly against white Americans. Question: A year ago, were white Americans the most discriminated against group in the United States? You said it. Answer. When we look at our legal structures, white Americans are often very disfavored in overt ways. Question. So your belief is that white Americans face more discrimination, at least prior to the Trump administration fixing this, than black Americans? Answer. On average, Senator, yes, that's correct. And I'm not running away from that statement at all. Question. Just tell me how you define white identity and what you think is being erased about white identity. Answer. African American Christians might worship differently than white Christians. Certain types of Anglo-derived culture comes from our history. Question. Like what? Answer. If you were to look at the book by one of your former Senate colleagues, Born Fighting, about this sort of Scotch-Irish military culture and certain, pride that went with that, that would be one example. Question. You should be able to tell us your thoughts on how white identity is different than other kinds of identity and how it's being erased. Answer. The white church is very different than the black church in terms of its tone and style on average. Foodways could often be different. Question. And those are being erased? Answer. Music could be different. See, if you look at the Super Bowl halftime show, which was not in English. Question. So our ability to access white churches or white food or white music is being erased? Answer. I am concerned with the majority common American culture that we had for some time, that through particularly mass immigration, I think, has become much more balkanized, and I think that weakens us. And again, I'm not running away from that comment. I'm not apologizing for it. Now, I'm going to have to say it straight out. It's almost the before we were white brand at this point. I do not accept the MAGA definition of American identity. I do not accept most traditional versions of American identity, for that matter. I am not patriotic about myths, symbols, great men, or capitalism. I'm deeply skeptical of nationalism in general. I believe the two most important changes to U.S. democracy required right now are the introduction of proportional representation and the removal of money from politics. I fear neither will ever happen. I do not belong to that cohort forever thanking troops for their sacrifice in serving the arms industry and big business in their forever wars. If you agree to kill Iranians this year, all because a corrupt man hopes to divert attention from the Epstein Files scandal, and because his Zionist donors think a broken Iran helps Israel, you are not protecting American freedom. if you are just following orders and summarily executing people on fishing boats in the Caribbean, you are not serving the cause of American liberty. You're a murderer. Saying such things in a nation as hyper-militarized as the USA loses readers and listeners. If speaking out against unjustifiable killing loses subscribers, I'll take the hit. I do not believe that the founding fathers were some form of secular saints. I do not believe that British America, nor the USA which usurped British America, were ever exclusively Christian spaces. I do not believe that the USA is a city on a hill, nor do I believe it to be morally, structurally, or politically exceptional. There are better countries and worse countries to live in. What I do believe in is the good that can be found in people everywhere. I suppose people have to be born somewhere, and many of us happened to be born in the USA. Being born in the USA means being born with certain advantages and disadvantages accruing from hundreds of years of history over which we had no control. America is a land obsessed with identity, especially racial identity. That too comes from hundreds of years of history over which we also had no control. Identity is a complex concept, and there will always be people, religious leaders, political leaders, family, who attempt to gatekeep, control, and or weaponize identity. These are the people who believe that self-identity is a credential to be scrutinized by the bouncer outside their gang's exclusive nightclub. They call their exclusive nightclub America, with club and gang members referring to each other as real Americans. If our credentials are accepted, right skin color, right religion, right taste in music, we may be let through the door where we can become a club member. And if we agree to abide by the credo, dress code, symbolism, lingo, and rules of the club, and if we have enough money, we might even be asked to join the gang which owns and runs the club. It's all stupid, because we all know that the street just outside the door is also called America, and that street is in an American town. And the town is in an American state, and that state is in a nation with America in its name. And the USA is contained within two vast continents called the Americas. The gang running the exclusive nightclub can keep pretending that their white, Christian, English-speaking gang should rule the streets, towns, counties, states, country, and even the world itself. But deep down, they know it's not possible. The percentage of people self-identifying as white Christian plummeted from 57% to 41% between 2003 and 2023. They are no longer the majority demographic in the USA. And so they lash out in anger. The people who believe that white is an ethnic group cling tightly to the things they consider culturally white. That's why our Jewish Presbyterian Jeremy Carl spoke of the white church versus African American churches, as if Mavis Staples or the ghost of Aretha Franklin were regularly waltzing down the aisles of Southern Baptist churches, threatening white Christians with their black gospel sounds. Please. Like a first-year sociology student at community college, Mr. Carl also spoke of white foodways, as if they're somehow separate, special, and deserving of protection from non-white encroachment in America. Huh? The whitest people in America are probably the descendants of Scandinavians escaping poverty and even famine in places like Sweden and Norway during the 1800s. So, sure, let's live off boiled turnips and fermented fish and cabbage like our white forebears. But since Mr. Carl spoke explicitly of Anglo traditions, perhaps he's a fan of gruel made from pinhead oats or broad beans and boiled mutton fat. You go right ahead there, sir. No tacos or barbecued chicken wings for you. I could go on, but as a lover of music, the most egregious claims made by white nationalist Americans about white culture involve music. In particular, country music. Now, hold on right there and bear with me. If you're waiting for this podcast to assert and reveal the exclusively black roots of country music, that's not where this is going. Because American country music is probably one of the most truly American things imaginable. Not because it's white, not because it's black, but because it actually represents the real American melting pot. Now, most white Americans, when they hear the words melting pot, what they are actually picturing are separate melting pots. White Americans tend to believe that they come from the white melting pot, which may include Irish, English, Scots, Welshmen, Germans, Swedes, Dutch, French, Polish, and a tolerable amount of Italian, even Latino, Indigenous American, or Jewish heritage. Yet if a white American really comes from the legacy background praised and lauded by people like Senator Eric Schmidt, their chances of coming from a completely white European melting pot become vanishingly slim. The often impoverished underclasses who first settled the American frontier, the people so hungry for land that they were willing to squat in Indian country and risk reprisals, the people who went on expeditions out of their stockades and forts to hunt down and kill Indians and burn their villages. These people were what one might kindly call rough. But these rough people were no racial purists. They didn't shoot Indians because they weren't white or weren't Christians. They shot them because the Indians were shooting at them for stealing Indian land. Racism always follows the crime. Racism is the justification which follows enslavement or colonialism. They're savages. They deserved it. Violence demands justification. Racism becomes that justification. And then racism metastasizes, leading to more violence. It's a truly vicious circle. The racism used to justify ethnic cleansing and slavery in America even extended to prohibitions on interethnic sexual relations, misogyny. But these prohibitions were only selectively enforced, mainly because access to all females at all times is just another ugly extension of the power dynamics of caste and patriarchy. As the current White House incumbent so eloquently explained, it's about grabbing them by the pussy because you can. But setting aside the sexual violence endemic throughout much of American history, it remains a simple fact that the poorest of the poor were the social group least likely to observe social prohibitions on interethnic mixing. The American underclasses of the frontier were mixed ethnic. Period. Anyone who doubts this will run up against reams, and I mean reams, of actual documentation. And these mixed ethnic underclasses are the very people who seem to have largely invented what white nationalists now call country music. The music they try to claim as something exclusive to white culture. I'm going to close out this piece with a couple of examples, plucked from roughly the middle of the 135-year-old era of country music recording, to illustrate my point. The period in question, spanning the 20 years after the end of World War II, is often called the Golden Age of country music. The Maddox Brothers and Rose were a hugely popular group during the 1940s. Buck Owens and his Buckaroos found their peak popularity during the 1960s.
They're gonna put me in the movies. They're gonna make a big star out of me.
Both bands only came into being due to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl catastrophe, with many first or second generation Kansans, Texans, and Oklahomans, often from a Deep South or Appalachian background, being forced to migrate west in search of work after the collapse of viability of their small farms. For many, the road west led to California. For the Maddox family, the trail ended in Modesto. For Buck Owens, it ended in Bakersfield. Both groups were innovators, with the Maddox family standing at the junction called Country Boogie, which would soon morph into rockabilly and Western-style country music, while Owens, like Johnny Cash and others, stood at a fork in the road where honky-tonk and rockabilly would split off and become rock and roll in one direction, while the other fork led to the Bakersfield sounds, the outlaw movement, and even Southern rock. Almost all of these genres were deeply influenced by the blues, and later rhythm and blues. Anywhere we go in search of the people writing, performing, and recording early hillbilly music, as it was called, the music which would eventually morph into country music, we find people from complicated, mixed ethnic backgrounds. The Maddox family were descended in part from people once called the worthy poor of Georgia, who migrated into Georgia anticipating the land lotteries which would follow the ethnic cleansing of Indians from that state. The thing is, many indigenous peoples in parts of Georgia avoided the Trail of Tears west by being classed as white or all others due to their intermarriage with settlers. Maddox ancestors like the Tuggles, for example, are found in households during the 1800s, which included people enumerated as all others, rather than white. Without DNA testing, this writer is unable to hazard a guess whether these people were part indigenous, African, Romany, or indeed mixed, or some other as yet unidentified brown ethnic group. Other Maddox aunts and uncles intermarried with a southern branch of the Melungeon Sizemore family, people known to count many people of color among their kin, including Indigenous Americans and Romany Gypsies. Bill Cox of Fayette County, West Virginia, who wrote the Maddox family's most famous hit, Sally Let Your Bangs Hang Down, had a mother who is extremely hard to pin down with documentation. This was often a sign a person may have been of Indigenous background. If she is the same Lola West who pops up in Berkeley County, West Virginia in 1920, she was enumerated with the letter C, presumably for colored, a term more ambiguous at the time than many realize. It's unclear whether she was ever even married to Cox's father, but Lola West's second husband seems to have been a coal miner named Andy Crouch, enumerated variously as black, mulatto, or white on various census forms, depending on where he was living. Maybe Bill Cox's unconventional background informed some of his not-so-squeaky clean songwriting. Sally Let Your Bangs Hang Down is a song about a peeping Tom and someone called, euphemistically at the time, a working girl. Explaining the complexities of Buck Owens' ancestry would require another piece entirely. I can only refer readers to earlier podcast episodes and writings dealing with the Black Dutch of Appalachia for a primer. What is certain is that many of the people who would later be identified as white hillbillies, and marketed as such, were being pigeonholed by a music business mostly unaware of the actual ethnic roots of hillbillies. This makes it seem even more strange that a cultural form being marketed aggressively as white music at the time was imbued with a sound and so much imagery clearly borrowed from non-white Anglo cultures. Stage costumes incorporated indigenous American fringe work with traditional Mexican and Jewish Belarusian and Jewish Ukrainian embroidery. It's highly doubtful whether the rhinestone cowboys of the 1970s realized that the rhinestones and sequins, so much a part of Western apparel, were the innovation of Jewish tailors back east in 1930s New York. Tailors who had spent years outfitting strippers and burlesque dancers in sparkling attire. At any rate, just listen to a few bars of Buck Owens and his Buckaroos playing their 1965 instrumental hit, Buckaroo. The sharp ears will notice a certain Latin spice to the drumming. And they'd be right. This was a large part of what gave the Bakersfield sound of people like Buck Owens and Merle Haggard a new energy, different to the Nashville sound. The drummer for the Buckaroos was a Mexican kid named Guillermo Cantu, Willie Cantu, the son of migrants escaping the chaos of Mexico during the revolutionary years there. Hell, even the word buckaroo is lifted from the Mexican word for cowboy, vaquero. The earliest known recording, which might be loosely described as country music, was a wax cylinder recorded by a black Louisiana man named Louis Vanier in about 1892, when he was about 34 years old. Does this mean that country music was invented by a black man? Of course not. That would be like finding the earliest known recipe for red-eye gravy written on a scrap of paper by a housewife in West Virginia in 1847, and concluding that because her maiden name was Jones, then red-eye gravy must be a Welsh invention. History and ethnography don't work like that. Besides, Thompson's Old Grey Mule, the song which Vanier recorded, was actually a minstrel show-inspired song, written by a son of German immigrants. Go figure. What this recording does tell us is that the thing later called country music was certainly part of Black Louisiana culture during the 1890s. It is totally understandable that many Black Americans want to explore the full role of their forebears in the making of American culture, including country music. But country music isn't just a black thing any more than it's just a white thing. If we are open-minded and care to read enough and dig enough, we will discover that many of the best things in America are not kept in boxes marked white or black. Some things really, really, truly came from the rarest of places in American history. The zones where segregation, both mental and physical, was set aside a bit more readily than elsewhere. The places where old-time music, hillbilly music, country boogie, country music evolved. Southern Appalachia, parts of the Deep South, the Southwest, were just those kind of zones. This was mostly due to shared economic injustice, no doubt. Poor people created country music. Poor people of every hue, because in America, poor people have always been a mixed people. My people. And I'll be damned if people like Eric Schmidt, Jeremy Carl, J.D. Vance, or a bunch of fools in MAGA hats are going to take the music of mixed ethnic poor people and slap a racist white nationalist ownership label on it. Some of us still know where we come from. Thank you for listening to episode 24 of Before We Were White, Give Me Back My Country. I'd like to thank all of my patrons and listeners. All music recordings used in this episode were included for educational purposes under the Fair Use Doctrine. Additional music by Dave McLaughlin and Ray Cohn. Until next time, stay safe out there.